Good afternoon. On behalf of Ed Steele, Chairman and CEO of EAS Consulting Group, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Successfully Respond to FDA 483 and Warning Letters, presented by Robert Fish. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus on assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, cosmetic, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenter is Senior Advisor for Quality and Compliance, Robert Fish. Mr. Fish joined EAS Consulting Group in November 2006 after 10 years consulting for FDA-regulated industries. He spent 33 years with the Food and Drug Administration, the last 6 years of that service as Director, Division of Field Investigations. He was responsible for general policy and guidance for the agency's domestic and international investigation activities. He also managed the foreign inspections operations. Prior to that, Mr. Fish was Director of Compliance at the Nashville District Office and was also a Supervisory Investigator at the Nashville District Office. Mr. Fish began his career as an investigator in the Minneapolis District Office in 1962 and subsequently served as an investigator at the Grand Rapids Residence Post and the Detroit District Office. Bob is experienced in all aspects of FDA-regulated products. He has expertise in compliance matters and current good manufacturing practice regulations as they relate to the pharmaceutical, device, and biologics manufacturer. Further, Mr. Fish is ISO 9000 lead assessor trained and is an AFDO certified HACCP instructor. He is a sought-after expert speaking at international events on FDA inspections and GMPs. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions of Bob by typing them into the chat box. With that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Bob.
Well, hello everyone. This is Bob Fish. As Victoria has told you, I appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon for this discussion of responding to FDA 483s and warning letters. So I will just immediately get started into this discussion and presentation. So let's first just look a moment at what the FDA 483 really is. Many of you are probably very well aware of what that dreaded document is, but as I'm suggesting here, it's just a factual listing of objectionable conditions. Now the FDA investigator or investigator team will present that document at the end of the inspections. They'll discuss the observations with management at that closeout meeting. And they will be looking for responses, verbal responses from management as to what the observations are and what your suggested corrections are going to be. Now, we suggest that that 483 may be annotated by the investigators. I'll discuss that a bit more in future slides, but basically, you may have an opportunity make some corrective actions before the conclusion of the inspection, and if those corrections are noted, pointed out to the investigators generally will annotate or make a notation, probably just handwritten notation on the 483 that some corrections were made and observed before they left the inspection. Now, there is, of course, a legal basis for the FDA 483, and we find that in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act under Section 704B. What you see on your slide is just an exact quote from that section of the Food and Drug Law. What you will note in the statement is that it is the investigator's judgment concerning the 483 observations. Keep in mind that the 483 observations issued by the investigator have not yet been reviewed by any FDA management. So it is strictly the opinion or judgment of that FDA investigator. Now you will also note the last 2 points say that it will be issued for filthy, putrid, or decomposed substance, or if the product was prepared, packed under insanitary conditions. The reality is, as many of you know, is FDA uses the 483 for much more than just these particular items. 483s are regularly issued whenever there is any observed deficiencies in any of the GMPs, whether that's for drugs, for devices. And so don't think that anything on there will just be for filth or insanitary conditions. It's much more than that. Now, there is no legal requirement to respond to the FDA 483. However, as you will find as we go through future slides, you're probably wasting your time if you do not respond within 15 business days. I quote here from the September 15th, 2009 Federal Register, a statement that says if the response within 15 days, if the response is received within 15 days, FDA will respond. If it's beyond 15 days, they don't need to respond. Now, most of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that the Federal Register is a document that's issued every business day by our federal government, and that is where FDA and all federal agencies publish any and all of their recommendations or policy statements. So now let's look more on the time frame for responding, because we find that many companies just are not meeting that time frame, and we see that, for instance, in warning letter statements. For instance, this first one that I'm showing on the slide, FDA says, this is from a real warning letter, that we acknowledge your written response, okay? However, because this response was received more than 15 days, response has not been considered. So we don't know the details of when the response was made, but since it was not within 15 days, whoever sent it in really wasted their time, because FDA says very clearly they didn't even consider it. Now let's think a minute about how we might manage the FDA inspection before we get the FDA 483, so we might be in a better position to respond to any observations. What we suggest is that with proper inspection management, the response will be easier. Now, the whole idea of managing the FDA inspection is a whole nother presentation, which we could talk about at some other time and place. But certainly, if you have a plan in place and know how to manage this inspection, what your expectations are, the FDA expectations are, it probably will make things go easier. So we suggest that if you can get the investigator to have closeout discussions each day, you may well get some indication what might be on the FDA 483. So if you do have some knowledge of what's going to be on that 483 before it's actually issued, you may have an opportunity to make some corrections. Therein, as I stated on an earlier slide, the FDA 483 might be annotated regarding whatever corrections that you made or promised to make. So during the closeout discussion, then, the investigator will discuss each of these observations. You want to make sure that you understand the observations, and if perchance the investigator is inaccurate or incorrect, you want to try to clarify that with the investigators before they leave the inspection. Now, if you disagree with an observation, we suggest that you don't argue with the investigator, but you clearly make your position known, because arguing with them really has no future at this point. Again, if corrections were made during the inspection and before the investigator leaves, make sure that you point them out to the investigator. If it's physical corrections or things like that, show them what they've done, because in all likelihood, as we suggested, they will annotate the 483. Now, that observation will still appear on the 483, but if they make the annotation that correction was made and observed, certainly it looks much better for you than if nothing was done. So we can't overemphasize the importance of this response to the 483, because we know if a response is done quickly and efficiently, it may prevent the receipt of a warning letter. If you have significant, serious observations on that 483, however, you can almost be certain that you will receive a warning letter. So the response should be done as quickly as possible, as there is considerable risk to the company of further regulatory action, at least a warning letter. And keep in mind that you must respond within 15 days or you're really just wasting your time. So I want to go through a few slides now and just look at a few examples of inadequate responses. Because all too often companies go through a lot of work and they write a response to FDA, but they really miss the point and are not going to get the benefit that they could have gotten if those responses had been detailed and correct and sent within the 15 days. So we look again at an inadequate response statement, and basically all of these come from warning letters, because FDA may or may not give you very much feedback on just a normal 483 response. They might have some communication with you, but most of these examples come from warning letters. So in this instance, is based on the information you provided in your response in June, we're not able to assess the adequacy of your corrective action to your BPRs. Now those are batch production records, okay? And so FDA is saying we intend to verify the accuracy of that correction and other corrective actions at a future inspection. So, you know, they're going to come back to see you. They were going to come back at some point in time anyway, but if you got a lot of 483 observations, certainly there's a good likelihood, even if you don't get a warning letter, that FDA will be back sooner. Now we look at another response here. FDA says we received your correspondence. Adequacy response cannot be evaluated because of lack of supporting evidence regarding the in-process controls for your product. Now, very often, companies respond that they have changed procedures, written new SOPs, whatever the document in question might have been, but they make that statement, but they don't send the actual changed documents to FDA. So it's impossible for them to make a determination if the corrections were really adequate or not. Okay, so here's one where they're acknowledging response, that you're getting specifications. However, it says this same issue was cited previously on an FDA 483. So now we have repeat violations. This is certainly something that you must avoid, because if FDA finds the same issue on 2 or more inspections, we have repeat violations, and we can be almost certain that FDA is going to take some kind of regulatory action, at least a warning letter, if not more. Continuing on, and I won't bore you with very many more of these inadequate responses, but I think it's important to study these and understand what not to do, and then a bit later I'll try to explain a bit more what we think you must do. So again, FDA says we've received your response, okay? Our comments regarding the adequacy of the actions you took to correct the correct the observations are detailed in the violations listed below. Now, this is a warning letter. Now it's really too late. The corrections that were submitted were not sufficient to avoid the warning letter, so now the warning letter has issued, but in the body of the warning letter in these instances, they would point out why the responses were not adequate and why you're still getting the warning letter. So now let's just think for a minute what happens after the FDA 483 is issued. When the investigator or the investigator team leaves the inspection, they go back to their duty station and they prepare a written report. This report is called an Establishment Inspection Report, or EIR. Now, this report discusses in details all the FDA 483 findings and a lot of other details about the inspection itself. That EIR then is submitted to a supervisory investigator, such as I was at one point in time in my FDA career. That supervisor reviews the report, summarizes the issues and observations that were made during the inspection, and then submits that to further agency review for regulatory action if in fact the supervisor concludes that there are violations of law. Now that report could be classified then as official action indicated, which means that probably at least a warning letter is going to be issued, or there could be some other regulatory actions suggested or recommended, or there could just be voluntary action indicated, which means maybe you have responded and the FDA and the supervisor concludes that the response has been adequate, and they'll just schedule you for a routine reinspection, or that there was no action indicated because there really were no significant observations made. So at this point, this is just a recommendation made by the supervisory investigator. If that supervisory investigator recommends that a warning letter issue, then it moves on to other compliance officials who make that determination and actually prepare, write, and send the warning letter itself. So let's think now about how we're going to organize our thought process for actually responding to that FDA 483. Our first suggestion is that you consider a triage approach, if you will. We can kind of look at these observations maybe in three different groups, but the first one being those that are easy to address and can be done in relatively short time. Another group may be those that you know how to address but will require an extensive period of time to address, or the rest which might require further study to develop a position or a corrective action. So this can begin our thinking, our sorting process, if you will, as to just how we're going to prepare a response. At that time point, you may need to think about, do you need some help? When should you consider calling a consultant or an attorney? We point out a few situations where we think that might be appropriate, as if you do not have the internal expertise or experience, to know what you don't know about the situation. If you don't understand how to properly respond to a 483, 483's observations are critical, and you might require a product be withdrawn from the market. In such a situation, you most certainly probably want to have outside help from consultants or even from an attorney as to how to approach that. Thinking a little bit farther about, do you need help? If you don't have sufficient personnel and resources, if you want a review or a second opinion on your response and corrective action, or if you want to know if it can be done, should be done, or has been done. Very often, EAS gets involved at this step in helping people put together a proper, adequate response to a 483. Now we think about just some of the benefits of getting some outside expert help. It's that they probably have a broader and more in-depth understanding of the regulations and the FDA expectations, have experience with current industry practices. They can suggest corrective actions known to be acceptable to the agency. And they know how to format and write an acceptable response, can provide guidance on various ways to address the observations, and they can ensure observations are addressed from a global or systematic perspective. What often happens is we at EAS may work with an attorney as well at this point in time in structuring what we think is the proper response to the 43 observations at hand. Further, we can write thorough and compliant SOPs. If you are short on staff or you're just not quite sure how to write SOPs, we've seen a lot of them. We know how to write them so that FDA would be satisfied. We can provide training if that's necessary and supplement companies' internal staff in implementing corrective actions. Might be more cost effective than hiring new staff. We can attend meetings if FDA wants the staff or the management to come to a meeting. We can provide technical expertise and demonstrate that the company really has commitment to compliance. So let's now think a little bit about just what the content of the response should look like. First of all, do not overpromise what you will do, because FDA will be back to see if you did what you said you would do. If you said you are going to do something in a particular time frame, FDA will be watching, and they will be back to see if, in fact, you met those commitments. Second, you want to address each observation completely. Then you need to look across the operation for similar issues. If, for instance, the observation related to batch records for a specific lot of product, you need to be sure that you look for that issue in other batch records. That is, you look systematically and globally across your operation to make sure that that same observation couldn't be made with other products or other records. And that's the systematic global approach that FDA expects you to be taking, and that you will do, and you will point out in the response that you have done. Now you want to provide reasonable time frames for completing corrective actions. Reasonable, of course, is a judgment decision, but if you say you're not going to get these corrections made until 12 or a long time down the road, FDA is probably not going to accept that. You're going to have to try to figure out how much time you're really going to need to make these corrections and make a commitment in the shortest time frame that you think you can live with, in fact, to get the work done. But remember, if you commit to get something done within 30 days, make sure that you, in fact, can complete it within 30 days. And then you're going to include documentation of corrections that you've made. For example, already mentioned the fact if you have revised documents, if you have written new SOPs, new specifications, you're going to make certain that you submit those new documents to FDA along with that written response. Also, if possible, you want to document that you have determined the root cause for the issues. That's another unwritten FDA expectation, but if at all possible, you want to do that. We can point out to FDA, we have determined why this happened, and we can further point out to them what corrective actions we've made to hopefully prevent it from happening again in the future. And then we might need to commit to periodic status update reports. If we say something's going to take several months or maybe a year or whatever to fully complete the corrective actions that we plan, we may want to be making monthly or quarterly or some sort of periodic status update reports to FDA. And we'll tell FDA in our response that that's what we will be doing. If we can do it, we want to assure FDA that the quality of the distributed product was not impacted. That's always one of FDA's first concerns, is consumer protection, and if there is defective, ineffective, dangerous product on the market, they would expect that the company would remove it from the market. So if we can make that determination with on a reasonable scientific basis, we want to do that. Also understand that the FDA 483 and your response can be released under the Freedom of Information Act. If they get a specific request from someone for a copy of your 483 and your response, it must be released. Now, certain confidential commercial information is deducted out of that report, but keep in mind that it will be releasable. Also, keep in mind that as a general rule, a warning letter should not be issued if the agency concludes that the firm's corrective actions are adequate, that the violations that would have supported the letter have been corrected. So this comes from the Regulatory Procedures Manual, the FDA Regulatory Procedures Manual. So this just emphasizes, again, FDA's perspective on how important it is to get a good 483 response. Because if that 483 response is adequate, in their own words, you should not be in danger of receiving a warning letter. Okay, so let's, I went through some examples, some written examples, mostly coming from warning letters of inadequate responses. But now I'm going to discuss just a few bullets of what we see and what we suggest in terms of problems with 483 responses. The first one we see all too often, I think, is suggesting that everything is caused by inadequate training. Now, very often, inadequate training is part of the cause for the problem, but we can't just throw that out there as our response to every observation that FDA makes. So think about that when you're structuring your response. Yes, it may be true that training is part of it, but in all likelihood, there's more than just training involved as the cause for that observation. Another common problem is lack of supporting documentation for the corrections made. Again, the company responds that they've made such and such a correction, and they describe the correction, but they don't submit the documentation to support that. You have to prove by showing the documents that you really did make the correction that you stated that you would be doing. And arguing about the observations. There is no future in arguing in person at the conclusion of the inspection or in the written response about an observation. In the written response, you have another opportunity to respectfully disagree with the FDA observation, and you may get some agreement from FDA officials, but don't get into a back and forth argument about a given observation. Another one then is committing to unattainable or unrealistic goals. A company may say, okay, we've got your 43 observations, we'll have everything fixed within 1 week, when clearly that's totally not something that's doable. So again, when you make commitments for certain time frames, make sure that you can complete the corrections within that time frame, because FDA will be back to check on that. Another one is failing to implement corrections described. We've seen that in our consulting business, where a company has responded to a 483 saying they'll do certain things. We go in and sort of a follow-up audit status, and we find they really haven't done the things they said they were going to do. Or worse than that, FDA comes for a reinspection, and they find the company hasn't made the corrections they stated they would make. That's almost certainly going to be a warning letter that will follow. Another problem we believe often could have avoided problems for the company if they had brought in outside experts to assist and advise in their response. Okay, so now let's think a moment about what is a warning letter. Again, I'm quoting from the FDA Regulatory Procedures Manual, where they say warning letters are issued only for violations of regulatory significance. Regulatory significance, well, that's kind of a bureaucratic word, but we understand that when they issue warning letters, they're serious about the situation. They say significant violations are those violations that may lead to enforcement actions if prompt and adequate corrections not made. And those future enforcement actions we'll talk about a little bit in the future slides. Now, as opposed to the 483, the FDA 483s, where they are available to the public upon request, warning letters are published. FDA publishes the warning letters on their website, and if you haven't already looked at that website, you'll want to go into the FDA website, search for warning letters, and every week, I believe it is, the list of warning letters that were issued in the previous days will be in fact published there. So, warning letters are often the result of an inspection and an FDA 483 issued, and we can add to that now inadequate response to that FDA 483. However, there can be other reasons why warning letters are issued. There could be pre-market issues associated with new drug applications, abbreviated new drug applications, or PMAs, pre-market approvals for medical devices. Advertising and promotion is generating a lot of warning letters these days. Particularly, we see this in the area of dietary supplements, where companies are making certain claims for their dietary supplements on their website or in some other electronic media. Then FDA is monitoring that regularly. You need to know that and understand that. And if they find that in those websites you're making unapproved claims for those products, you are going to get a warning letter addressing that issue. It may also be issued for label or labeling issues. During FDA inspections, the investigators usually collect product labels. Those labels are reviewed by FDA experts. And if there are label violations, you could get a warning letter concerning those violations. And there's a multitude of other laws or regulation violations that could result in a warning letter. Now, finally, it usually requires a reinspection to resolve warning letter issues. Sometimes just your written response will be adequate, but generally you won't be taken off the out-of-compliance status, so to speak, unless and until there's been a reinspection done to confirm that you really have made the corrections you said you would make. The warning letters are also issued to foreign firms. These letters, again, are usually based on FDA inspections or on the FDA 483 findings. And when a warning letter issues to a foreign firm, the evidence standard is significantly different. For FDA to stop entry of foreign products, they only have to show that the product is appearing to be adulterated or misbranded. So it's a much lower standard than it is for domestic products. And these warning letters typically include a provision for an import alert or automatic detention. So for instance, if FDA does an inspection of a foreign drug company, they find violations of the GMPs, they will issue a warning letter to that company asking for corrective actions the company is going to make, but that company would immediately be put on the automatic detention list, which means any products they would attempt to ship to the United States would be automatically detained without sampling, without analysis, unless and until all of those GMP violations were corrected. So foreign firms have a little bit more to risk, probably a lot more at risk than do domestic firms from that standpoint. Now, there are a variety of regulatory actions that FDA can take after a warning letter is issued. Don't misunderstand, they could take some of these actions without ever issuing the warning letter. But after warning letters, some of the typical ones we might expect would be product recalls, seizures, injunctions. Under some of the device areas and other areas, there's a provision for administrative detention of product. There's civil money penalties. There's criminal prosecution. There's withholding of new drug applications or abbreviated new drug applications. For instance, if the warning letter was issued as a result of a pre-approval inspection, the warning letter, in all likelihood, would state that the NDA or ANDA will not be approved unless all the corrective actions have been made and verified, those items that were listed on the 483. And then finally, as I mentioned above, for foreign firms, they can be put on an import alert and onto the automatic detention list. Now, FDA has some stated purposes for issuing warning letters. Certainly, they want to stimulate voluntary correction. Now, we can argue whether, as a result of a warning letter, a company is really taking voluntary correction, but the warning letter doesn't have any legal standing as far as any action in the federal courts, which could come after the issuance of a warning letter. So I guess we can agree it is a voluntary correction. They also want to establish a record of prior warning should there be further regulatory action. If you are issued a warning letter and you don't make adequate corrections, they could bring further criminal or civil action against you and your company. And finally, it really does establish rules or guidelines for the industry as a whole. Most industry management are monitoring the FDA warning letters because it gives us a real good insight as to just what FDA thinking is about various regulatory compliance concerns and issues. So, responding to warning letters really isn't significantly different than responding to an FDA 483. However, we're now in a much more serious situation. The stakes are much higher, so to speak, because a warning letter indicates that higher FDA management has reviewed the issues and the agency is prepared to take regulatory action if the issues are not promptly corrected. Consider that difference as opposed to the FDA 483. Remember, the FDA 483 was the investigator's judgment or the investigator's opinion. Yes, that establishment inspection report is reviewed by FDA management, but the 483 was not reviewed by any FDA management before it was issued, so it doesn't necessarily represent the FDA position on the observations. Whereas a warning letter, you got to know FDA is serious now, and they will take further action if you don't correct those issues. So when we respond to a warning letter, we need to keep that in the back of our mind. And we need to also consider all of the same things that apply to the FDA 483 response. It's just that now it's a considerably higher priority. Now, there are certain standard statements that we see in all warning letters, and this is one of them. This letter is not intended to be an all-inclusive list of violations. No. When an FDA inspection is made, or when we as EAS do an audit for a company, we certainly are not so naive as to believe we found all the violations that might be happening at that company. But we've made a good sampling, and we certainly have an impression of the compliance of that company. And that's what FDA is saying here really. There could be other violations. And again, as we talked about earlier in responding to the 483, you need to look across your observation. You need to make a systematic global evaluation of your operation to make sure that you identify any other similar violations that might be occurring at your company. So what the statement means that if you did not cite a particular violation in the warning letter and FDA discovers it later, that doesn't mean they can't take further action against that. So you must do everything you can to be certain that you do not violate any other FDA laws and regulations beyond those that are specifically cited in that warning letter. So another standard statement that's in a warning letter, it says that you should take prompt action to correct all of the violations. And then they finally say failure to implement lasting corrective actions may result in FDA taking regulatory action, and they just mentioned seizure and injunction. But as I pointed out earlier, that's not the only thing that they can do. So a warning letter really is a promise to you as a company that if you don't correct those observations, FDA will do something further, and you won't like what they do in the future actions. So you must take effective corrective action, or FDA will take further action if in fact you're the recipient of a warning letter. Now there is one other item that I want to mention in this presentation, and that is a regulatory meeting. Sometimes FDA may request top management to come to an FDA office for what they call a regulatory meeting. At that meeting, they may likely hand deliver a warning letter, and this may indicate that the issues are more serious, or it may just be the FDA wants to be certain that there's a clear understanding of the issues and the expectations on your part. So if you are requested to come to a regulatory meeting, don't get too nervous and excited. It may just be that there's some specific issues FDA wants to clarify. But don't take it lightly. If you are requested to a meeting, be prepared for that meeting. Keep in mind that a written record of the meeting will be made. Any verbal commitments are the same as written ones. FDA may want to attempt to reach an agreement or something like that concerning corrective actions. So the main point is be prepared, and there will be a written record of that meeting. So know that before you go into such meeting. So now let's try to just quickly summarize what I've been talking about now for a better part of 45 minutes, I guess. So in summary, if we understand the process and expectation, we think that's the key to successful responses to 483s or warning letters. We need to pay attention to the details and documentation for corrective actions. Attempt to set up continuing communication with FDA. You may ask for some feedback. You may or may not get that, but particularly if you're going to have update requests, update status reports, if you will, going to FDA, you will have some continuing communication. Further, we recommend that companies have qualified experts perform an in-depth GMP audit, gap analysis of their facilities and products. Maybe after we have made all the responses, maybe we come back in, or some qualified expert comes back in and does a gap analysis just to make sure that everything got implemented the way we thought it was going to be. If FDA comes back, we're not going to find any of those repeat violations, because that's not a desirable situation to find yourself in. Based on the violations and deficiencies found, comprehensive corrective action should then be aggressively implemented. And you got to keep FDA in the loop. Let them know what's going on with these periodic reports or whatever commitments that you've made as a follow-up. Okay, that's the end of my prepared slides. I think Victoria now is going to come back on the line if there are any questions.
Yes, I think actually, Bob, you may have answered our first question later in the presentation, but I just want to confirm, so the FDA does not publish the 483s. They can only be obtained through Freedom of Information. Is that correct?
That is correct. The FDA 483s are not published, but they are releasable under the Freedom of Information Act.
Okay, all right, thank you. And what happens if a company does not respond to an FDA 483 or a warning letter?
Well, if you do not respond to a 483, I'll take that one first. Depending on the seriousness of the violations, there may be nothing farther that happens until the next reinspection. However, you all can judge the seriousness of 483s, and if the 483 observations are similar to what you've probably seen in other warning letters, you can be quite certain that you will receive a warning letter if you don't respond to that 483. If you do not respond to a warning letter, in all likelihood, further regulatory action will be taken. They could come in, for instance, and they could take seizure actions against your products or request you to recall certain products if they thought there were serious defects with products. So you certainly want to, we can't say legally that you must, but you certainly want to respond to both FDA 483s and warning letters.
Okay, our next question, it may take me a minute to read because it's a little long. So as a seafood importer, how can a company prepare proper documentation to pass an inspection and avoid the FDA 483 to begin with? Is there a primer or a guide that can be reviewed?
Can you repeat the first part of that question? I didn't quite catch that.
Sure. Hold on. Okay. So as a seafood importer, how can a company prepare proper documentation so that they pass the inspection and they won't have to, they can avoid having a FDA 483 to begin with?
Well, if you're a seafood company, you're going to have a HACCP program in place. And certainly your HACCP program, if it's properly implemented, monitored, it should avoid any significant serious 483 observations from an FDA inspection. And you may want to consider outside experts to evaluate your program, but beyond having a HACCP program in place, I'm not sure I have any other good suggestions.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us what a seizure is?
Okay, well, a seizure is an action taken through the federal courts. If FDA has determined, for instance, that there's something seriously wrong with a particular product, if it's a food product and it has pathogenic organisms in it, for instance, or it's a drug product and it wasn't produced under adequate good manufacturing practices, FDA can identify a quantity of product. It could be all the product that's in the possession of the company at their warehouse, and they prepare a document which is filed in the federal court that says they have documentation to show this product is adulterated and or misbranded, and they're actually asking the U.S. Marshals to go out and take possession of that product. That is a seizure of that product. So that's where the term seizure comes from. It's a federal action against a quantity of product for either adulteration or misbranding violations.
Okay, thanks. And if a company knows they cannot submit a complete response within 15 days, what would you recommend?
Well, if you know you cannot make a response within 15 days, sometimes through your attorney or with or without your attorney, you can approach FDA and ask for an extension of time to make that response. Usually, if you've had that communication with FDA, they will grant you a reasonable extension of time to make that response. Alternatively, you could write as complete a response as you're able to within the 15 days and tell them you will be providing continual update as soon as it's reasonably possible to do so. But I think my first action would be to let them know that I'm probably not going to be able to make a complete response in 15 days and see if I can't get an extension of time to make that response.
Great, thanks. And what would you suggest if a company disagrees with certain FDA 483s or a warning letter citation?
Well, as I suggested in the content of the presentation, I certainly don't suggest that we get into an argument with the investigator or FDA over 483 or warning letter citations. We have an opportunity to respectfully disagree in writing if there's certain issues that we think are just not right, or FDA just doesn't totally understand all the facts. You may even request a meeting with FDA officials to sit down in person with them to try to explain and describe actual situation, and possibly you could get some change of mind, if you will, on the FDA part.
Very good. Okay, and our last question was whether this presentation is going to be provided to the participants, which I believe it will, but I must apologize. This is the first time I'm hosting a webinar, so I need to confirm that after our presentation. So I will certainly let everyone know via email. Either you'll receive that or I'll let you know that it's unavailable, but you certainly will be able to watch the webinar again. We have it recording and we're going to post it on the EAS website. So I'd like to thank you, Bob, for providing an informative session. For anyone in the audience, as I said, this will be available on our website for you to review later on via a podcast. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you all very much.